Okay, so now that we have talked a little bit about variables, I have to mention an issue. This is not something that's really going to come up for you in your small basic coding, because in small basic, if you want to create a variable, all you have to do is dream up an appropriate name for that variable and type it into the code window, and boom, you have your variable. Other languages, you have to be a little more proactive in creating variables. And so I don't like if you keep coding after this course and you get into a second semester programming course where you're using a more serious language, for example, Java or C# or C++, then you're going to have to contend with the issue of data types. And so I do want to explain it. I'm going to explain it within the context of Visual Basic. We had talked about Small Basic as kind of like a little offshoot of Visual Basic, kind of like a toy version of Visual Basic. Visual Basic is a more serious programming language. So I have here the temperature converter program in Visual Basic. A lot of it is the same as what we have seen in our small basic programs. Some of it is different, but what I want to do is bring your attention to these two lines up at the top here, where it says dim temp var as integer, dim temp cells as integer. So I have two variables, temp var and temp cells. These are to store the temperatures in degrees Fahrenheit and degrees Celsius. And the word dim is that's short for dimension. That's that's very old-fashioned. That's just kind of a term that's stuck in the basic languages. You don't see this anywhere else. So don't really focus on that. What we're doing in these two lines are declaring variables. And by declaring, I say we are declaring that we want to use two variables in this program, and we are calling them temp var and temp cells, and very importantly, I'm making them integer types, because not all data types are the same. I happen to use integer in this program because I'm thinking of, if the user's entering the temperature in degrees outside, they don't care about a half a degree or a fraction of a degree. If it were a scientific application, then we might care about that kind of precision, but we don't, so I just used integers. That's fine. We'll look at a few other data types, like if, for example, we were doing a money program and we needed a decimal component, there are options for that. Integer would not suffice in that case. So anyway, we're declaring a variable. So what's happening here is I'm introducing the name of that variable into the program. I'm laying down the law as far as the data type that it is. And what happens when these lines execute is those variables are created in memory. That memory is set aside to actually hold those values. So that's how you would create a variable in Visual Basic. And I am going to show you a chart here with some of the Visual Basic data types, just so you know that these exist. And you'll see, like if you do end up coding in Java or C# or something, you'll see the same types of data types, more or less. So for example, we have the string type, which would hold string data, a string of characters all strung together in quotes, like for example, Moraine Valley Community College. It's a very clear in use of string data. We have the char type, and that would be for a single character on the keyboard. Okay, so yeah, and it could be an actual character on the keyboard, or even just a character that is not on the keyboard, like a smiley face or some other kind of special character, but just one character. That's really the key here. We have the date type, and the date time does include a time portion as well. So this would be fine for dates or times. For example, any of those values would be fine in that data type. Integers. These are whole numbers, obviously, positive or negative, and the integer has its limitations. With an integer, typically you would get 4 bytes of memory set aside for an integer, and in that range, in that 4 bytes, you can have a range of values approximately negative 2 billion to positive 2 billion, approximately. And which is fine, that those are huge numbers. But let's say I wanted to store the world population which is, at the time of this recording is about 7.5 billion or so people on Earth. And the integer would not cut it. You can't put a number that big into an integer. The limits on an integer is approximately negative 2 billion to positive 2 billion. So in that case, I would use a long. A long is one of the integer types, but that stands for a long integer. And with a long, it's like 8. It's 8, but typically you would get 8 bytes in memory. Set aside 8 bytes in memory, and the range of numbers that you can put into 8 bytes as opposed to 4 bytes is huge, okay? And by huge, I mean approximately negative 9.2 quintillion to positive 9.2 quintillion. So I mean that we're talking about, enormous numbers here in the 8-byte integer. In which case we could put the world's population in there without a problem. So so the integer, the long integer, the decimal, if you have a money program, you have a fractional component. That's one of the data types that you could use to store a decimal number. Okay, certainly the go-to in Visual Basic. And then the Boolean, this will store a true or a false value. And we are going to be working with true and false values in Small Basic as well. But, again, in Small Basic, you don't really have to care about data types per se. You're using them behind the scenes, whether you realize it or not. But Small Basic it's very forgiving as far as data types. You type the name of the variable, you provide a value in it, and it knows what kind of data type to use behind the scenes. So you just don't have to think about that. But you do have to think about it in other languages, as I said, and maybe I'll just throw a little quiz at you or something with some data types, just so you have an idea that this exists and you kind of file it away in the back of your mind, because this probably is not the last you're going to hear of data types.